If you've ever been frustrated, to say the least, of HubSpot's native out-of-the-box approval process for quotes, you're not alone. If you're unfamiliar with it, let me show you exactly what you can do. So inside the quotes option inside of HubSpot, the only option that you have in order to turn on approvals is to actually require approvals for literally every single quote that your team builds in HubSpot, which means even when your team is building quotes that don't require approval, they still have to wait for it to get approved. On top of that, the options that you have in terms of who gets to approve a quote is literally just one person in your whole portal. Okay, this is unacceptable for teams that have much more advanced sales processes or complex sales processes that may need different quotes approved by different people under different circumstances, and maybe not every single quote needs to get approved. The list goes on and on. The main point is that HubSpot's native quote approval process does not work for most people that need quote approvals. That's why we built features directly into Quote Happily that can help you do advanced approvals. And we did this in a way that really just makes sense. So what we did is we took quote-based workflows in HubSpot, and we've injected workflow actions that let you use HubSpot quote workflows the way you always expected you should be able to use them, which is to create either the most simple or most complicated and complex quote approval process of your dreams. Let me show you how it works. So I've got a quote-based workflow here, and the way I'm triggering this quote-based workflow is we say anytime a quote is pending approval, and in this case, if it's in a certain approval queue, which I'll show you what that is in a second, that quote will enter this workflow. So essentially, when a quote goes out for approval from Quote Happily, it goes into this pending approval status. It may or may not have an approval queue depending on how complex you build out your different approval processes, but it'll start to go through this workflow. All right. Now, there's a couple of different actions that we add into quote-based workflows that are completely unique. So the first one is this request quote approval. Now, what this does is this will actually send an email to whatever email address you put into here. You can also drop it in using a personalization token if you want to do that too as well. And this will actually tell those folks who get this email to go in and approve the actual quote itself. And on top of that, you can add this as many times as you need to, and you can structure your workflow to follow different processes depending on different attributes of the quote. So for example, here, I have two people potentially that would need to approve quotes based on how much the quote is worth. So what I'm using is a standard branch in this HubSpot workflow to say, hey, if the quote amount is greater than $10,000, finance needs to approve this quote first. If it's less than $10,000, it can go directly to the sales managers. Now, in this case, I have two different email addresses in this request quote approval action. So what's going to happen here is both of these folks are going to get the email, and they can choose which one actually does the approval, and whoever approves it first moves the quote along the workflow down to the next step, right? So as soon as a quote gets sent to somebody, it's held in a delay in this workflow action. And when someone approves the quote using the link that we give them after they look through the quote and they go, yep, sounds good, it'll actually release it from this workflow action to go on to the next step. So in here, what I've done is I've said, hey, if it's over 10,000, the first thing that needs to happen is finance approves the quote. And then as soon as it's released from that action, it'll go down to the sales managers, and the sales managers can approve the quote. However, if it's less than $10,000, it never goes down this branch, and just the sales managers need to approve the quote. And then finally, we have this publish quote action. Now, this doesn't require any configuration. What this does is it takes the quote and it puts it into a published state. However, it's smart enough to know if the quote is going through any other approval workflows. And what it'll do is it'll check to see if there are any other pending approvals that need to happen in other workflows before it actually releases it and publishes the actual quote. It's smart enough to do that. So that's how our two workflow actions work. You can configure your workflows to follow whatever steps it needs to take, right? But also, I mentioned this thing called approval queues. Now, approval queues is actually something you set in a rule that puts a quote into an approval. So in this case, I have this like basic discount approval for 10 to 25% discounts. This is a rule that I set up in our rules engine. If you haven't heard about the rules engine yet, go check it out in the video that we have for rules engines. But essentially what I'm saying here is if the discount percentage is between 10 and 25%, I'm setting an outcome that requires an approval. So when I'm building the quote, it'll basically say, hey, you got to send this quote to approval, and then it will put it into that pending approval state. But I'm also setting an approval queue, and I'm choosing the sales approval here. So what this lets you do is if you have multiple workflows set up, you can tell the workflow to fire off when the approval queue actually matches that quote, right? So if you want to go into one workflow or a different workflow, depending on how you have your conditions set up, you can set it up however you want, right? It makes approvals much more advanced and much more palatable and useful for teams that have more complex sales processes.